Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for abandoning a beautiful day in London for the basement of Chatham House. We're delighted to have so many of you here. My name's Jonathan Rugman. I'm a reporter with Channel 4 News, and I've just come back from Egypt, which I hope helps. The event is being held on the record. We would ask you to put your phones on silent mode if you haven't done so already. And I should tell you that the event is being live streamed, which means that people outside this room can participate via Twitter if they wish to. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, starting on my left. Maha Azam is an associate fellow here at Chatham House, an expert on the Middle East and political Islam. I thought we might particularly ask her about the Muslim Brotherhood. On my immediate right, Dina Wabha was in Tahrir Square on June the 30th when the protests reached a tipping point. She also participated in the 2011 revolution and is a women's rights activist. My far right, Jane Kinnimont, known to many of you, a senior research fellow in the Middle East, expert on the international relations of the Middle East. And we thought we might turn to her at the end to talk about the regional implications of what has happened and a little bit about the economic implications as well. Basically, what's going to happen is we're going to give each speaker 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will turn over to questions. I don't know if you've seen the cover of the latest issue of The Economist, Egypt's Tragedy. Quite a contentious cover, I think, because a lot of Egyptians, millions of Egyptians, would not regard this as a tragedy at all. And I'm not sure I would either. The situation is that Morsi had a year in power. In the eyes of many Egyptians, and indeed in the eyes of some of his supporters, although they won't necessarily admit it, he blew it. He blew that opportunity. I've started calling this a revocation. In a desperate attempt on Twitter to try and satisfy all parties, and an attempt which has failed because if you call it a revolution, you exclude the Muslim Brotherhood and its supporters, who won 51% of the vote last year, who will never accept that this is a revolution. They will always call it a coup. And of course, the protesters in Tahrir Square who say this is not a coup, this is the army doing the bidding of the people. That would be their argument. It struck me while I was there that it was a marriage of convenience between the army and the protesters until the army went back to barracks and the protesters went back to bed. And it's a marriage of convenience which can easily resurrect itself. This is not over by a long chalk. I put out 2 tweets last week before Morsi fell to describe my reporting approach to Egypt, and I thought I would give them to you to sort of know so you would know where I was coming from. My first principle of reporting Egypt is never interview somebody in an office, because they don't count. And throughout our coverage, I think we only interviewed one person in an office, and that was Adli Mansour, the interim president, who was sworn in last week. It's an interesting state of affairs when a man in a suit and tie in an office is not where you go. We often talk about the Arab street, but Egypt became its street during crucial days last week. The only exception to my rule, apart from Adli Mansour, would be if that person in an office is wearing military braid, then perhaps one should talk to him. My other rule was never assume that Tahrir won't get what it wants. Tahrir was full of people last Sunday, June the 30th. And we know from 2011 that having toppled one president, they had every right to think that they could prove all the Middle Eastern experts wrong yet again and topple another. And that is what happened. And I would say to you that even if you think what occurred was a military coup with very negative consequences, I think that the people of Tahrir will be back if they do not get what they want. If it turns out that the army does not go back to barracks, and it doesn't turn out as well as those protesters thought, they will be back. So this is not this is very much unfinished business. I'm going to start by turning to Dina, I mean, you were there on June the 30th. Could you explain a little bit about who organised these protests? We know about this group called Tamarod, which means rebellion, and it claimed to have 22 million signatures calling for the removal of President Morsi. I take that with a big pinch of salt, but clearly there was a massive protest. How was it organised, and who did it speak for?
Well, actually, before I start, I want to say that your account is very refreshing. I've been hearing all sorts of experts speaking, especially from the media from the West, and your account is by far the most balanced that I have heard.
I'm not sure that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I have to say, it's so refreshing to hear something a little bit different, and something that actually, an account that actually looks at the people and cares about what the people say and cares about the people on the street, not just the Muslim Brotherhood and the military, not just seeing the Middle East from the view of political Islam or the military. So that's very refreshing. Who organized these protests? Actually, just like what happened on the 25th of January 2011, it was an open call. Of course, I wouldn't say that Tamarrud or Rebel, they called for the people to go, the political parties called for their people to go on the streets, but it was an open call basically for people. And what happened on that day was actually, it was fascinating. Even though I participated in the 25th of January revolution, it was still fascinating for me to see things happening again on the 30th. I remember we were walking in a march, in a actually 2.5-hour march. It was not in Tahrir, it was in Ittihadiyya, in front of the presidential palace. And as we walked, people just started coming out, just regular people, normal people, not politicized, not political parties affiliate. Of course, there were affiliates of political parties, but like normal people would just come down from their homes and just join us. And old people, young people, everyone I know took to the streets. And I have to contest the point about the 51% pro-Morsi in the elections. Actually, many people who gave Morsi their voices gave them as so that they wouldn't give them to Shafiq. They gave them not to the Muslim Brotherhood.
A democratic vote.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not saying it's not a democratic vote. I'm just saying this, that not the 51% are not the people. Among the 51%, many people were on the streets calling for early presidential election. My own mother voted for Morsi, and she was crying with tears when the military intervened to ask him to leave. So
families were split over this?
Not really, no. I think over the first one, the
well,
elections.
You said your mother was in tears over Morsi being.
She was happy.
Oh, right.
Tears of joy. So.
Things have reached a pretty pass when protesters in Tahrir Square are carrying pictures of General Sisi and chanting his name. What a change on a year ago when they were trying to get the army out of politics.
I don't think we can box all the people in Tahrir Square, all the people in Ittihadiyya, and all the people in all the other squares in the governorates into one general segment of people who want exactly the same thing. Yes, there was one thing, which is the ousting of Morsi, which is early presidential elections. This is something that we all agreed on, but there were other factions who wanted different things, and they saw the next transition period differently. Some of them wanted Sisi, some of them just wanted Sisi to intervene in order to save the situation. Some of them resorted to him as a strategic last resort, that there's nothing else to do about this, because they wouldn't cooperate, they wouldn't work with us, they wouldn't agree to have
to be fair, President Morsi was fighting a battle he couldn't win because the army gave him an ultimatum to reach a compromise with the opposition, but the opposition refused to talk to him. So he could never win that battle.
I don't know about the claim of the opposition that didn't want to. They have always had this claim that the opposition doesn't want to talk, and I know for a fact that this is not true. Everyone has been trying very hard to strike a deal with them, and they just wouldn't. They just went on, and they just wouldn't listen to anyone. They really thought that they have the streets. They really thought that they are the majority, and they just wouldn't compromise.
Can I just ask you what somebody from a sort of mature democracy like this one might ask, which is, why couldn't you give the man another 3 years? Why couldn't you let him go to the end of his term?
I have to say that at the beginning, I felt like we should give him the chance. We should give him 3 years. we should go by the democratic process, because I am so implicated in this idea of formal Western democracy that I just couldn't imagine any other way. But when I went down on the streets on the 30th of June, and I was like taken away by the sheer number of people on the streets all wanting one thing. And at that point, I felt, who am I to think that I know better than all of those people how their lives should be ruled?
Can I, at that point, I think, turn to Maha and ask you about the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, I visited their big protest in Rabat in Nasser City several times, and there were tens of thousands of people, but actually nothing like as many people as in Tahrir and Alexandria and other places. The argument that you would put to them would be that a kind of revolutionary street democracy, sort of measured by aerial photographs taken by the army, which the army very deliberately published, had trumped the ballot box. That Egypt is in such a position in its development that there is, as I said at the beginning, that the street is where Egypt is, and that the Brotherhood should accept that they had failed. That is what you would hear from opposing voices.
My starting point would be that Egypt had decided on a course of democratization, and that there is a process involved in that. And that process is one that entitles everyone to have their rights defended and protected. And that going outside that process and overturning the democratic process through a military coup, even though it had large, huge numbers of protesters outside backing it, means that it charts a path for Egypt and other countries that are starting off with the democratic process as a means to advance and to develop and to create stability for their countries. It charts a very dangerous path, because it means that the opposite can happen too. And I put it to you, and it's something that I think about, is if we'd had the reverse, if we'd had an elected liberal secular government in power and not Morsi, and we had huge numbers on the streets that were Islamists, Salafis and Brotherhood, and we had a military coup in their name, I expect that the reaction among many in the West would have been quite different. We would have been more likely to call it a coup. We would have been much more disturbed that we were going to have Islamists in power. And in a sense, we would have said they'd rejected the democratic process. So I think the issue here is really to what extent we believe that Egypt should abide by a democratic process, its institutions, parliamentary elections, referendums, and so on. So it's not that the numbers may have shifted, and they certainly may have shifted under Morsi, and the signs are they did, and his popularity waned. The issue is that there was a constant reluctance to turn to the ballot box. There were constant blocks from the judiciary and others to delay the parliamentary elections. One thing that the Muslim Brotherhood constantly said is, let's go to parliamentary elections. One time after the other, the issue of the electoral law needing reform, it went back to the judiciary. So what you had in Egypt, and you still have, and this is the worrying point, is you have institutions, both security in terms of the Ministry of Interior, the police, the judiciary, the military, very much part of an old order, not that only of Mubarak, but one that lasted 60 years, a system that is ultimately dictatorial. Versus, yes, people power on the streets, but ultimately those institutions are reluctant or are refusing to reform. And that is the main challenge that Morsi faced during that year.
Can I just go back to your point about this being dangerous? I would just query how dangerous it is. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood protest was relatively small in Cairo, and it still is. The second point is that in terms of pure British tourist and commercial interests, the fear must be that a radicalization will occur. People driven out of democratic politics will find targets, Western targets, and that cycle will begin. But the counter-argument is that if the country is continually on the skids and everybody's getting poorer under President Morsi, that radicalization was going to happen anyway.
I think that there are 2 points here. I think there's an element whereby we say we either believe that whether it's Egypt or other countries, people who have decided on a democratic path can uphold those institutions, and it's not just about our interests and radicalization. And that to say that the numbers of the Muslim Brotherhood are contained and small in Rabaa is also open to question, because they are contained. It's almost like containing people in Tahrir in the early days during the Mubarak.
They were containing themselves, to be fair.
No, but at the same time, they're containing themselves because there are arbitrary arrests, there were killings, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood is being rounded up, and as we speak, probably the full weight of the security forces is coming down on Muslim Brotherhood supporters. So I think that is a key point. What you have is, you will call it a minority today, but you're talking about a very substantial part of society that is going to be repressed again, as it has been on and off for 80 years. And it's whether, again, the United Kingdom and the United States, when they stood up and said we support the Arab Spring and we support democratization, are then willing to be swayed in one direction, because, yes, there is people power on the street, but it's being implemented through a military coup. Now, that military, yes, as we hear over and over again, wants to hand over government to the people and doesn't want to be at the forefront of politics.
So you're saying that a country that couldn't sign off on a $4.6 billion IMF loan, where there were petrol queues, electricity shortages, where Morsi didn't command respect among his own ministers, that government should have been allowed to continue?
No, I'm saying that government faced the challenges of a system that was still intact, and that's why it faced those challenges. And what you have now is a return of that old system, and that's why it's going to be able to do business again, because you're going to have vested interests, corrupt ministers, and corrupt business interests coming back. And those are the ones that resisted Morsi, and institutions and a bureaucracy that did not want any reformist president. It didn't want an Islamist president reforming them because of the ideological factor as well, but it wouldn't have wanted even a liberal or leftist president coming in to reform them and change the pattern of politics and create and hold people accountable. And I think that's the challenge that Egypt still faces. You may have a change to an elected president today with the backing of the military very much, yes, in the background, but very much in control of the political agenda. And you have the institutions of the state and old business interests coming in and, in a sense, reaping the rewards of the new investments coming in from the Gulf, and maybe the IMF loan coming forth, and things will seem better again for an elite and somewhat better for the majority, because there's greater security and a return to more tourism. But ultimately, have you had a revolution? In a sense, you haven't really reformed the institutions of the state, and you haven't delivered, not to the Islamists alone, but to the revolutionaries who came out on January the 25th.
Can I finish by asking you about the reintegration of the Muslim Brotherhood? When I went to see President Mansour, he told me that the Brotherhood were part of the fabric of Egyptian society. They must have a place. Quite rich coming from him the day after the president had been put under house arrest. But I mean, clearly this week, there's going to be no integration. More than 50 of their followers have been shot dead. But can you see a situation in which the Muslim Brotherhood can be persuaded to take part in elections by February?
I think the Muslim Brotherhood are committed to democratic politics. They are committed to a civil society. But I can't see at this particular moment, with, as you say, protesters and supporters killed, with the rounding up of their leaders and so on. And the fact that they felt that they played by the rules of the game that were disrupted, not because of them, but because of a military coup, and because of, yes, the sheer numbers on the streets, but ultimately because of a military coup, that basically they're acquiescing to the military engaging in politics again and setting the agenda. I think that in some ways the showdown eventually in Egypt will be not just between the Brotherhood and the military, but between Egyptians and the place of the military in politics.
At that point, let me just move to Jane. Can you, for those of us in the audience who are concerned about economic stability and investment in Egypt, can you see this? I note that the petrol queues have shortened dramatically, which has led many to think that they were deliberately lengthened in order to create a situation of crisis for the army to intervene. But can you see any good winds blowing from what has happened economically for Egypt?
The main economic boost that's likely to result is going to come from the Gulf aid. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have announced $8 billion in aid. Gulf aid is sometimes slow to materialise, but both those countries have a major interest in supporting what's happened. The UAE foreign minister was, I believe, the first foreign official to congratulate Egypt on what had happened. It's fascinating, really, that you have two countries which themselves ban all forms of street protests, congratulating Egypt on this. But it reflects their very deep concerns about the Muslim Brotherhood's influence in their own countries. The UAE had just arrested a number of Egyptians that it accused of plotting against it, and had also sentenced some tens of Emirati dissidents accused of belonging to a local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have an interest in stabilising Egypt's economy. But of course, aid doesn't solve the underlying problems. One of the key slogans in the first revolution was bread, dignity, and social justice. And these grievances around economic inequality, corruption, economic injustice, a creaking education system, poor healthcare, those grievances have existed for many years. They're not easily going to go away. I fear that the new government, which includes some renowned economists, Hassan Biblawi, Ziad Bahauddin, and so forth, may inherit quite inflated expectations. Morsi was heavily criticised for mismanaging the economy, but in fact, a lot of the economic problems, such as the drop in income from investment, the fall in tourism, and the consequent plummeting of Egypt's foreign reserves, these are symptoms of a lack of confidence which fundamentally stem from political uncertainty. That international perception of political uncertainty is still there. It may have been made worse by what's happened in the recent weeks. Many people aren't going to be booking themselves winter holidays to go from Europe to Egypt. And the underlying policy problems, the fuel subsidy problems, the exploding public sector wage bill are going to be extremely difficult for a short-term transitional government to seriously address.
Can you explain a little bit more about why you think the Saudis and the Kuwaitis have taken the path they've taken, and the Qataris having backed President Morsi quite heavily to the tune of many billions? I mean, do the Qataris back whoever is in town and then change horses accordingly?
Well, Qatar itself is undergoing quite a dramatic transition because of the abdication of the emir and the installation of one of his sons, who's now the youngest ruler anywhere in the Middle East, 33 years old. And already we were seeing signs that he, whether through personal choice or perhaps through regional and Western pressure, was moving away from Qatar's perceived position of really siding strongly with Islamists. So you've seen a decision to cede a lot of the management of the Syrian opposition to Saudi Arabia. You've seen news a couple of days ago that the Taliban would be closing, if perhaps temporarily, their new office in Doha. You've seen him quickly join the UAE in congratulating Egypt, whereas Turkey, which used to be very similar to Qatar, has been adamant that this is a coup. And given that Qatar already seems to want to recalibrate, this is probably an opportunity for it to say, we're going to stick with the rest of the Gulf, we're going to have a common GCC policy towards Egypt and continue to back this new government.
Presumably the Turkish position, which as you say has been very adamant, is on the basis that the Turks exemplify political Islam and some accommodation with a avowedly secular republic. But there is no overlap with Egypt, is there really? I mean, the Brotherhood and the AKP are very different. And trying to pretend that there is a sort of Ataturkist compromise to be met in Egypt is quite hard to argue.
They're certainly very different countries, but I think the Turkish reading is partly based on their own experiences. Erdogan has direct experiences of military coups himself and is very sensitive to that. He was also clearly very conspiratorial, blaming all sorts of foreign agents for the protests that took place against him. If anything, I think this will harden his resolve to take a tough line against his own protesters, because he will be more afraid of those sorts of supposed conspiracies.
And can I ask perhaps everybody on the panel, just to finish, I mean, this debate about whether it's a revolution or a coup, it's not, I mean, it is important. I mean, the policy decisions stem from it. As we know, the Americans are still delivering fighter jets because they have not called this a military coup. Do you call it a military coup?
Yes, I've looked up many academic definitions of coups since this happened. This fits every definition that I can find, because the military deposed the elected president and also suspended the constitution. Now, those who say it's not a coup say, firstly, that it's popular, and secondly, that the military handed power over to a civilian government. But that's actually been seen before in many cases. That doesn't change the definition of a coup, however much people would like it to. The US decision to avoid the word coup is clearly political. They don't want to cut off aid to the Egyptian military. They need that leverage. It's important for maintaining the peace treaty with Israel. And also, importantly, that $1.2 billion in military aid mainly goes to buying American-made arms. American jobs depend on it. The defense industry in the US will be lobbying Congress to say, keep this going. We need it for our economy.
So it's important that it's not a military coup.
But that's a political decision.
Yeah. Dina, do you ever, I mean, you've defended what's happened, you were part of Tahrir Square, but do you ever feel a little bit used by your armed forces, who may have been planning this for some time?
I just have to comment about the question that you asked about, would you say that this is a coup? I just find our obsession with definition very interesting. While since the very beginning of the revolution, I stopped looking for textbook definitions for anything that the Egyptian people are doing. I don't know what you mean by used by the armed forces. So far, everyone has a crystal...
Well, you may come to regret what you wished for.
Everyone has a crystal ball that is looking into the future and seeing horrible things. And so far, there are indicators that we are going into a transition period with a roadmap. And like you said, someone asked me, do you trust the military? And I said, I trust the people, just exactly like you said. If the military decided to stay, and if the military, if they don't deliver, and if this turns into another dictatorship, I have no doubt whatsoever that the Egyptians can take down as many dictatorships as they will come.
Maha, just to finish, there's a lot of hostility to the use of the word coup. It's become quite dangerous for journalists in Tahrir Square for a new reason, which is some of us have called it a coup, and protesters don't like it. What do you call it?
I call it a coup. I think the military intervention in Egyptian politics is not new. They intervened in 1952. They were the backbone of 3 dictatorships. They've intervened again, always in the name of the people. They intervened in the name of the people in 1952, and they've intervened again today in the name of the people, part of the people, to undermine a democratic process.
But you're essentially saying that Dina here has been had.
No, Dina has not been had. Dina has real aspirations, and aspirations that I share, and actually overlap with the aspirations of even Muslim Brotherhood supporters. Because the people who stood in Tahrir, and I was with them too in January 25th, and I stood against the army in September the 30th as well, I think it was 2011, were people who didn't want the military at the forefront of politics. But this is an alliance of sorts between those, a number of people who really want the revolution to happen, who want reform, people who are part of the old regime and a lot of the interest there, and the old state that just does not the wealthy in the old states, but the bureaucrats, the police force, and so on, that don't want to give up their power and don't want to see a change of regime. They've all coalesced, and they're willing to let the army come in and institute order. And that's what's happening now. And the army is going to still pursue its political agenda. It doesn't like the Brotherhood. It never did. It was worried about the Brotherhood's stance over regional politics and so on. So it has interfered at this particular stage to preserve its interests, its economic interests above all else, although they tried to reach some kind of modus vivendi with Morsi, and the position within the constitution was good. That's going to be maintained. I can't see that changing. And that's why I say that further down the line, there is going to be a recurring friction between military and civil, whether through people who are more secular inclined or more Islamist, it doesn't matter. The point is that that friction is going to continue as it did in Turkey over the next decade or so.
Thank you very much. I'm going to throw this open to the floor. If I could ask you to ask a question of anybody on the panel rather than make a speech, it would be much appreciated. Can I take this lady here? Yes. There's a microphone, a roving microphone that's on its way.
Thank you very much. Heather Blake from Reporters Without Borders. And I was hoping to ask both speakers their viewpoint on where press freedom falls in all of this. With this pursuit of a democratically run secular country, we have seen television stations shut down, and we've also seen foreign journalists harassed and targeted for simply using the word military coup. So if both speakers could give their viewpoints, I'd be appreciated. Thank you.
So three Islamist TV stations shut down, journalists arrested, and yes, a climate of xenophobia for those of us trying to report what's going on. What do you make of it?
No, I have to say, of course, I personally condemn all of these arbitrary closing down of channels and arbitrary arrests, but I have a problem behind this question and behind a lot of the talk and the debate here and other talks and debates is that people talk to me because I was on the streets on the 30th of June as if I am the army and that I have to defend the army and that I have to defend the wrongdoings that have been happening that I am, of course, against. So just to make it clear, I am not the army, I am not the spokesperson of the army, and I'm not going to defend any wrongdoings. And you don't even have to ask me a question. Of course, I condemn everything that is wrong that is going on. I condemn arbitrary arrest, I condemn closing down of channels, even though those same channels incited violence. And I think if someone would watch them for 5 minutes, they can find all kinds of lawsuits regarding hate speech there. But even this I condemn. Not only me, but a wide sector of revolutionaries who were there on the streets also condemned this.
But as time goes on, I mean, you can't say I can't speak for the army and then say it's a revolution and say you have no responsibility as a protester. And you have to take a view, don't you, on whether what you fought for and campaigned for on the streets, whether you approve of it.
Of course, I have a view. I have a view that I don't approve of this, of what's happening. But of course, I cannot speak for the army. And then everyone either wants to try to corner us either into the Muslim Brotherhood or the army, which is not true. There is a third way of trying to negotiate a better deal with both of them to have a better transition period and to have a better stake in life.
Maha, what do you make of
I think we're in a very dangerous juncture when it comes to press freedom or arbitrary arrests and so on. And I think the history of the military in Egypt, whether in the background or not, has been one in which we haven't seen freedom of press, freedom of assembly. We had emergency laws for 30 years under Mubarak. So I don't think the situation is going to get any better. I think the more dangerous aspect here today is that there is popular support. And because there has been so much anti-Muslim Brotherhood propaganda, not just now, but over many, many decades, to the vilification of the Brotherhood, it has created an atmosphere that, that kind of police brutality that may ensue now, the closing down of Muslim Brotherhood channels and so on, people will turn a blind eye to it. And that is the fear that the censorship that is happening under the cloak of, a new democracy and a better future for Egypt, and with the aid of the military, is one that's going to also be aided and abetted by the public. And that's what I fear most.
Thank you. This gentleman here.
I would dispute wasting time on the semantics of discussing whether it is a coup or not, because this implies a denial to the will of more than 30 million people in Egypt. And I don't want to go into more discussion about the points said, and I feel they are contentious and will take most of the time. But there is a document which I have here, which has a list of leading members of the Muslim Brotherhood Party, and the sums received by each of them and signed for from the Qatari government. Now, does this qualify a party like this to hold the power in Egypt?
Ma, what do you
I
think?
mean, the Qataris, it's a known fact, did send money to Egypt. Today, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar are going to send money. So the Turks sent money. I mean, and I don't think, that Suarez pays for all sorts of things. Tamarrud, whether it's one that's supported truly by the people, whether there were 22 million signatures or not, Suarez paid a lot into that campaign.
There's an interesting article in the New York Times today revealing that,
Yes.
that a businessman gave a lot of money to Tamarrud without
Yes.
Tamarrud being aware of it.
Yes.
And that, he was absolutely delighted with the way things turned out.
That's a very important article. I had a look at it today, and actually it tells you a lot about the payoffs, and also even within institutions and bureaucracy to stifle any initiative taken up under the Morsi government, to create blockages throughout the way. Now, I don't think this is an ideological stance, and I'm not making it as an ideological stance. What I'm saying is that the system is corrupt and open to corruption. Egypt, according to Transparency International, comes up 117 on a list of 178 countries. That's pretty bad. It's open to corruption by from all sorts of forces, and the corruption was very much there under Morsi, directing a political agenda against the Brotherhood.
Just very small comment. Implying that 30 million people were paid off is something that
I'm not
I can't
implying
accept.
that.
Implying that Sawiras paid, and this Sawiras card exactly that implicates Copts is something that I completely object to.
No, but I think it's important I just come in on here. I'm not implying that by any means. What we're saying is the Qataris paid money, the Kuwaitis, others, that businessmen of all sorts had different agendas, and this is why the situation is so complicated in Egypt. It doesn't undermine the fact that millions came out to protest and that there is a real impetus on the ground for reform and change. What I'm suggesting and saying is that the future government of Egypt is unlikely to perform and to deliver on those revolutionary demands or on the scale of reform that is really needed in Egypt.
Can I take this gentleman in the second row, please?
I wonder if I took this question to the panel. I think you are mixing Egypt with Switzerland or Austria. You are talking as if you are sitting in a saloon discussing and sipping coffee, whether this is a coup or not a coup. I think this is not the issue. The issue is to face real politics. The Muslim Brothers failed in government. They bungled every opportunity they had. And we cannot, I don't think the Egyptian people would have been having the patience to wait for another 3 years. They antagonized everybody, domestically, internationally, regionally. The lemon squeezers have got fed up, and this is exactly the result of it. Thank you.
I think you're right to the extent that it's a numbers game, and the army looked at the number of people on the streets and it acted in the way it did, but that does not exclude an element of cynicism about all this and about the army's motivation and how long it had felt the way it felt.
What do you think the army would have done in the face of 30 million people in the streets?
Well, I think that is the question. And I think, on balance, do you let the government roll on for another 3 years or do you do something?
They couldn't have afforded that, sir. They couldn't. The country was in ruins.
Let me just take this lady just behind you, if I may.
Hi, I'm Sari Yassine. I'm from Index on Censorship. So I completely understand when you're talking about institutional problems and there being corruption. But at the same time, the thing that really worries me is that you had this massive movement in the streets, and the thing that comes up every time is that well, this wasn't going to change overnight, or this corruption was there. My question is, what what was the solution when you had someone in power who was incompetent, who had many, many, many opportunities to bring the opposition to the table, to bring different views to the table? Like, I would argue that Morsi created a lot of messes on his own outside of the mess that was already there. So I guess my question is what was the solution at that point?
That's a difficult one.
Let me have a shot. I think, first and foremost, they should have gone to parliamentary elections. And the opposition consistently refused, with the support of the judiciary, to opt for parliamentary elections. And I think parliamentary elections, if there were 30 million, or 20, or 15, they could have, and they didn't trust in their own ability, they could have won seats in parliament. And that could have had an influence on the cabinet and on the president, and even forced early elections. And I think that is the mistake, that the opposition made. That actually, we're often talking about the mistakes of the Brotherhood, but I think the mistake the opposition made is, if it did have that much traction, as we saw through those protests, it should have campaigned, gone for parliamentary elections, which were round the corner and were actually delayed, and it would have had an influence in parliament, and Egypt would have been much better off.
Let's put that point to Dina. I mean, isn't the problem that revolution is addictive? There are a lot of people on the streets who don't have jobs. They carry on protesting and protesting and protesting, and perhaps what Maha is suggesting is that the responsibility should have been to campaign for parliamentary elections, not just to go out on the streets and think, oh, well, I've toppled one president, I'm going to topple another.
Well, you just said it. Egypt is on the streets. This is where Egypt is. I mean, to imagine, to imagine now, the Muslim Brotherhood always argument is that the opposition doesn't have any weight. And then when something happens, they come and say, why didn't the opposition gear the people towards that? So I think there's a paradox there. The will of the people were really greater than any opposition. I don't think that there's enough evidence to say that all the opposition was against the elections. I personally know for a fact that some parties wanted to go through with parliamentary elections, and there were talks among the opposition. But the will of the people triumphed any will of the other parties to give Morsi another chance, or to wait for a few years.
Let me take another question. We should bring Jane in as well. It's gentleman here on the left.
Does anybody on the panel really think that Egypt's an Arab country after all, is it not? Yeah? It's an Arab country, essentially. Arabic speaking and Arab, fundamentally. All right? Does anybody ever really think on the panel that the Arabs are capable of democracy? They're not, are they?
I think you may inadvertently have found a way of uniting all of our speakers. I don't. It's hard for me to find any reason why one single race of people should be incapable of a style of government that everyone else is capable of. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that this argument's been used against everybody. It's been used against all religions. It's
very offensive. It's very offensive.
I agree with
very
you.
offensive.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
This is very offensive. You are.
I'll come back on that.
Well, can I ask Maha to answer the question and then move on?
I agree.
So this is a free forum for debate. Can we give Maha the chance to
call others to call other racist remarks on people sitting here?
So give us a chance to rebut it.
This is not just an issue about Arabs. I'm not an Arab. I thought that was an absolutely appalling remark.
Yes, exactly.
Could we ask Maha here to answer the question and then move swiftly on?
I can that the Irish are no more capable than the Arabs are of democracy.
Maha, do you have anything to add?
Yes. I think it's a shame to take the remaining time for this debate in that direction.
Okay.
I think clearly what we have in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world is an urge for participation, for accountability, for the greater respect for the rule of law and human rights. And I think there's no denying that. Whether it's the demand of Dina, myself, or others who are connected to the region, I think these are core fundamentals that even if you don't like the Brotherhood, that's what they seek. They seek accountability, participation, and so on, and that's what they wanted from their government. They believed that their leader could still deliver that. Others felt he wasn't capable of delivering that, but they want someone else to deliver it. And this is why I think we're still in the early process of a revolution in that part of the world. We're still it's a long process, but that demand is not going to go away for greater freedoms, for the rule of law, and so on. And that this is just part of the struggle. We're having a counter-revolution, I believe, at the moment, that has made gains with the help of a coup and with the help of people who genuinely want to see change. But I think if they're denied that change and they don't see it over the next few years, they'll be out again demanding change and maybe again trying the ballot box.
We'll take another question. So this lady at the back here.
I already have the microphone. I'm the intern here. My name is Salma, but I'm also studying conflict at the LSE. And I have a question about your solution for early parliamentary elections. I think that is an interesting argument that is proposed a lot by Western societies as a potentially good solution. But I also recognize that you've brought up corruption and the entrenchment of old regime systems as in charge of the businesses and of many of the processes that have stalled actual change in Egypt. And my question is how you think that parliamentary elections can be disassociated with those entrenched regimes, because it costs money to have an election. And often the problem with early elections is that the people that have the money end up in government. So I was just hoping that you could elaborate a little bit with those incongruities there and what you think could have been possible.
I mean, I suppose is Egypt capable of a fair election? I mean, it's interesting that the army let the Brotherhood win last year.
Well, maybe reluctantly, but I think, yes, I think campaigning in all parts of the world is open to a degree of corruption, and I think Egypt probably more than others because of also what happened under Mubarak and the influence that's particularly happens in the countryside in terms of having influence by a particular figure, a business figure, or someone who has money. So yes, of course, it's open to that. But nevertheless, it's a better process than others. The elections that happened, the first parliamentary elections in Egypt, brought about an Islamist majority, and that parliament was annulled, and it was an attempt to again go back to the street and have parliamentary elections again, and that would have given an opportunity for other parties opposed to the Brotherhood to then campaign against them, because they probably would have had a better chance because there was a greater disillusionment with President Morsi. So the issue is we've maybe passed that opportunity, but at that point, over the last year, if we'd had parliamentary elections, we may have been able to salvage the situation. And you would have had perhaps a parliament that was in disagreement, but that would have been a pressure on President Morsi and may have even moved the country to being able to carry out those austerity measures and get the IMF loan. Although that, I think, will always be a difficult one, but is apparently more easy now because you've got the full weight of the military and security in order to undermine any street protests. But let's be clear that the revolution of the hungry is still very much on the cards.
We've got about 7 minutes left. Let's try and take as many questions as we can. Can I take you in perhaps twos? This gentleman here, and then Nadeem at the back.
Robert Woodthorpe Brown, Bureau member of Liberal International and also council member of Chatham House. I was at a meeting recently of our executive in Beirut where we had all the parties of members of the Alliance of Arab Democrats from the entire region. That's the answer to the democracy question. And we had 4 Egyptian liberal parties, 3 of whom are members of ours and 1 was an observer, and asking us for help in getting themselves together. We gather that since last week they've come together under the National Salvation Front, and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy will probably give them party building help, because frankly too many of the parties in Egypt are built from the top down and not from the bottom up.
Take a question from Nadeem at the back.
Thank you. Nadim Shhadi from the Middle East program at Chatham House. My question is about the regional and broader impact of what happened. I mean, I want to thank the panel, but they know too much. People who watch this from very far will not know the details and will not really understand. There's no perfect knowledge on that sense. In Latin America, they'll see it as a coup. There's no question about it. And you will get genuine questions, sometimes bigoted and ignorant, about whether Arabs are capable of democracy or not. And they are justifiable in such, I hear them in policy circles even, so it's not. So what's the broader impact on that? And did the army, in effect, save the Brotherhood from failure and made them into martyrs or victims instead?
Interesting question. Do you think the Brotherhood has emerged more strongly from this, in a sense, because it has proved its conspiracy theory right?
I'm not sure about stronger, but I think we know from most of its 80 years of existence that the Brotherhood is adept at existing under conditions of repression. That's what it's been accustomed to. So repression isn't going to make it go away. There are many people now proclaiming the death of political Islam. I think that's wildly premature. You have Salafists thinking they will benefit. You have also jihadis around the region saying this proves that the ballot box is nonsense and the bullet's the way to go. So you might see more diverse splintering of political Islam. But the Brotherhood's certainly not going away. They'll probably see this as a temporary reversal, looking at experiences such as Turkey. I also, if I can take a minute on the democracy and the regional dimension, it's worth remembering most of the governments in the Arab world are still autocratic, and they deploy enormous diplomatic and financial resources, making precisely this argument. Our people are not ready for democracy. They are not educated enough. They will use the example of Egypt, as they've already been doing for the past 2.5 years, to say they're not capable, they need dictators. And that means there is a huge burden on Egypt's shoulders. The prospects for democracy in the region, in the short term, fairly or not, are partly going to be determined by what happens in Egypt. And it is very important, therefore, for people to keep up that pressure on the military to make sure that a real democratic transition should happen. Also, we spoke about freedom of speech and human rights, and I think, again, this should be a lesson to all governments that there might be a day that comes when you wish that you had strong human rights organisations, because you might not be in power anymore.
Dina, do you worry that you may have radicalised an organisation which is not going to go away?
No, I don't, because and no one wants the Muslim Brotherhood to go away. I believe Al-Baradei came out and made a statement saying that he wants the Muslim Brotherhood to join the parliamentary elections. I mean, we have Salafis. We're working with Salafis, and the Salafis had a very strong stake in choosing the prime minister. So no one wants to repress political Islam or want them to disappear. But to what extent they want to participate, they didn't want to participate with the opposition in anything. To what extent they would want to participate, that's another thing. Just one last point about democracy. Well, the comment is very offensive. I'm not going to say anything. Yeah, I'm not, but the comment is very offensive. I feel personally very offended, me and most of the Egyptians, of course, in the room. But I want to say that we keep talking about democracy as if it's only the ballot box. We forget absolutely about minority rights, about women's rights, about inclusiveness, about the broader meaning of democracy. And I believe that not only Egyptians are capable of democracy, they are capable of refining democracy and standing up when they find that democracy is not working to make it even better for themselves.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I think we're